evening. I'm Jim Needham, and welcome to This Year in the Legislature. Tonight we're talking with 34th District Representative Hurley Goodall, who is returning to the legislature for his fourth term. Hurley, welcome to our program.
Thank you, Jim.
What do you see as the major issues that will be coming up in the legislature this year?
Well, there's always the issue of education and how it's funded, both at the secondary level and at the higher ed level. With Ball State here, that's an important issue for us. The issue of the state lottery will probably come before us in one form or another. Utilities will always be an issue in the state legislature. Probably some type of licensed branch reform legislation will be there. And we have a couple of other issues that deal with banking and beer baron legislation that's as so-called that will take some of our time. And then there are always those issues that no one can anticipate, like the dogfighting issue and the hunting dove issue that came up last year. We always seem to spend a lot of time on those issues that people get emotionally involved in.
Which one do you think will be the most difficult to handle?
Well, without a doubt, it'll be priorities as far as state spending is concerned, particularly in the areas of education at the college level and at the public school level. And, our mental health programs, prison programs, and those type of things. It's always monetary, budgetary problems. There will also probably be some serious discussion about a gas tax increase to increase funding for our roads and bridges.
Let's go back to education, which is the first thing you mentioned, which is a very high priority for this area of Indiana.
Mm-hmm.
What do you see that needs to be done for education, both kindergarten through 12th grade and at the post-secondary level?
Well, I think most legislators now recognize that education is tied closely to any economic development efforts in the state, and that we have to have an excellent educational system, both at the secondary level and the higher ed level, if we're going to attract new industry and keep the industry and keep the young people we have here in the state. The question is, how much can we afford to put in it to make it better? And that's always the question. You've got so much of a pie to divide, and how much will you give to each area of need? And that's where the problem comes, determining what the priorities are going to be and how much of that pie is going to go to each area.
How poorly do we do in terms of national ranking as a state in our educational system? Is it that serious a problem?
Yeah, from all measurable things that I've been able to find and determine, I think there are two basic ways that you can determine how well you're doing as a state. One is in comparison to other states, how much they're spending to educate each student. The other is what percentage of your gross state product or your tax revenues do you devote to that area. And in both instances, Indiana is down in the 40s among the 50 states. So I don't think we have anything to brag about in the state of Indiana as far as funding goes.
Well, on the other hand, I understand our state exports are about 8th in the nation as a state exporting I guess industrial goods or perhaps agricultural goods. And we're 14th in size, which indicates that we're ahead of our size in terms of what we're producing and sending out of Indiana. Is that a contradiction in terms in your mind?
Yeah, it's a contradiction in terms, but I think, there's a historical context to it in that a lot of times in the past people have said that if Indiana has a low tax rate, that will attract industry. Well, history has proven, at least to me, in my opinion, that that's not necessarily true. I don't think anyone wants to pay high taxes, but if we look at the fact that we've lost, I believe it's 50,000 people in the state of Indiana over the past 4 or 5 years because they're having to go other places to find jobs, employment, etc., that formula is not working. When new industry, particularly the high-tech type industry, comes into a state, they're looking for an educated populace that can fill the needs and demands that they have. And right now, Indiana is not fulfilling that requirement, and that's one of the reasons we aren't attracting as many of those industries as we could. or should, and it's also one of the reasons people are leaving.
What kinds of programs or changes need to be made in the educational system to beef it up, in your view?
Well, it's obvious the most serious problem is getting teacher salaries to the point where we attract the brightest and best of our young people who are coming out of colleges, coming out of high school, and making college career choices. Right now, a youngster is faced with the fact that if he goes into engineering or accounting or computer science or in the more advanced areas as compared to going into a public school system to teach, where the starting salary is probably $13,000 to $14,000 a year, as opposed to anywhere from $19,000 to $30,000 in these other fields. And I don't think it takes any genius to figure out that our brightest youngsters, when they make those career choices, teaching is not going to be their first option.
Are we losing our best young people to other states?
From all indications, we are, yes.
What can we do about that?
Well, the only thing I can say is that we have to renew our commitment, and as painful as it is, we have to put more money in and try to get particularly the starting salaries for our teachers up. And at the same time, in higher ed, we have to start looking at our salary structure so that we can attract the qualified and top teachers to come into our state to teach our young people. We just left a meeting with the Ball State president and some of his administrative people, and they informed us that Ball State University, for instance, is at the bottom in the Mid-America Conference as far as salaries for its faculty, and that's a comparative group of institutions in surrounding states that are similar in size to Ball State and similar in what they do as universities.
Do you think the legislature as a whole, both the Senate and the House, is attuned to the crying need for increases in education for higher education teachers? Or are they just hearing that and really tuned into some other priorities?
Well, I think at first there was a feeling that, money really wasn't a problem in education, and that there was a lot of waste going on, and there may be some of that. I don't know, but I think finally people have realized that education is a very important part of economic development. And now the business community has become very concerned with the type of products that our schools and universities are turning out, and retaining these people and having an educated populace to attract new industry. So I think there is a new support and commitment for public education. The question is, how will that translate into funding? And we don't know until we get through.
As a legislator, what kind of contact do you get from business telling you to support education? What do they say to you?
Well, we get quite a bit of contact. Every day we're attending meetings either put on by business groups or educational groups, farm groups, or whatever. And, the message is basically the same, that something has to be done. And they understand that it's going to cost additional funds to get that done. As I said, the question is, how much are we willing to commit? How much more? And that's always the question, how much?
That's a good question. How much do we have?
Well, when we started out, we had quite a bit. The last figures I heard is down to about $300 million that we will have. And that sounds like a lot of money, and that is a lot of money. But if you look at the demands of just, say, the public school system, that would take almost entirely that amount just for that one particular thing. We still have our state universities to be concerned with, our mental health institutions, our prison system. Those things are primary responsibility of state government. Plus we have a myriad of other issues such as our welfare system, our Medicaid system for our older citizens, and a lot of other responsibilities that state government has. So we're talking about a relatively small pie compared to the needs that exist.
That's a difficult job, isn't it?
It is.
Let's go on to another area of interest besides education, a second one that you mentioned, and that was public utilities and the rates and perhaps this Public Service Commission. Are there any changes there that you would make, and if so, what are they?
Yes, there supposedly the governor set up a task force that was to make some recommendations to him as to what should be done. There are a couple of immediate urgent problems. One of them is the Marble Hill situation in southern Indiana, where a nuclear plant was abandoned after $2.5 billion, something like that, had been expended. The question is, who's going to pick up that cost?
Who is going to pick it up? Are we going to pick it up as consumers?
Well, that's going to be one of the things that's decided. I know it's a serious problem because anything that we do could possibly affect utility users in other parts of the state. It's my understanding that if the company did go bankrupt, that would affect the bond interests for other utilities that had building needs and all. And at the same time, I have great reluctance in asking customers to pay for a mistake or an error in judgment that they had no part in making. In any other industrial or business enterprise, the people who own that enterprise get the profits, they make the decisions, and they suffer the consequences or the benefits of that decision. In this particular case, the utility management made a decision some 10 years ago to build a nuclear plant, and based on more need for power, the need has not developed. The opposition to the nuclear plant has become so great that they've had to abandon that plant. The question is, should the consumers who will never get any use out of that plant be asked to pay that $2.5 billion? And I think the precedent that is set is important to us here in this area, even though we're in the I&M area, and we're not faced with that. I think the precedent is set that the customer will pick up any mistake or error that a utility management makes is a dangerous precedent for us to set in this state.
What about the role that the Public Service Commission plays? What I've observed in the last couple of years, at least, is that utility rates have gone up. And what I read in the papers just this week was that Indiana utilities pay some of the highest returns to stockholders of any utilities in the country. Are those allegations true?
Yes, as far as I've been able to determine, that is true. I think Indiana has the second highest utility profit return in the United States. And there have been accusations by people that we have one of the friendliest PSC commissions to utilities in the country. And there's a lot of mistrust, and it does seem that any time the utilities go to the Public Service Commission, they come out with a huge increase. There are very few cases that anyone can recall where they were turned down or actually asked to reduce their rates. And this has created a lot of problems. There's a lot of talk about electing the Public Service Commission. There were some changes a couple of years ago to add a couple of new members, went from 3 to 5 members to give a little more geographical balance. Some people from the northern part of the state, people from the southern part of the state were put on the commission.
Who puts those on the commission?
The governor. Those appointments are made by the governor. He determines who the chairman of that commission will be, and also the makeup.
Is it bipartisan?
Yes, it has to be bipartisan, 3 of one party and 2 of the other. So, but the governor makes all the appointments, and he ultimately has the responsibility for what that commission does.
Are you pleased with what they've been doing?
No, I'm not. No, I don't think the consumer's interest has really been taken into account. It appears that everyone else, this is my own personal opinion, that everyone else has been asked to make sacrifices and have made sacrifices. They've taken wage concessions. People have lowered their prices on products and all, but our utility costs continue to escalate. There's question as to whether they're buying the most cost-effective fuel that they can to power the plants. There are just a lot of questions out there that it's such a complicated issue. I don't think the average layperson understands it. I know a lot of things I don't understand. I try to learn as much as I can, but I can say with what I know right now, I'm really not happy with the way the utility companies have been regulated.
One of the things that you asked in the poll that you sent out some weeks ago was, should Indiana Utilities be required to buy Hoosier coal? What was the answer?
The preliminary figures I've gotten back, I think I've gotten back close to 100 now, shows that people think they should. That will require putting in some costly scrubbers to take the sulfur out of that coal. But I think with Purdue University, one of the finest engineering schools in the United States, that if we really wanted to do it, we could find a safe, environmentally safe way to burn that coal and use it, which means it would be much cheaper since it's mined right here in Indiana. It would provide jobs for our miners here to mine that coal. And to me, it makes sense because we would also have some cost control over a natural resource that's produced right here in our state. So I think that's one of the areas we should really be looking at where we could help reduce or at least contain the cost of electricity for the public.
Let's move into another area now that's pretty politically sensitive, but has had a lot of attention, including apparently some action in the South Bend area just this last week, the area of license branches. There have been some abuses that have been uncovered in the last couple of years, although as a whole the system continues to function fairly well. What is your opinion about the way the license branches are handled right now, and do you think this will come up in this legislature and will there be some action?
I think so. It was given such high visibility in the past gubernatorial campaign, particularly by Senator Townsend. I think it's to the point now where the political system has to respond in some way to that. I've always felt it was wrong for any person to have to involuntarily contribute to any political party in order to drive in the state of Indiana. Driving is not a luxury, it's a necessity. And I don't think people should be forced to contribute to a party in that manner. I do think we have to be realistic, and there has to be some way to fund our political system. Otherwise, you have a few large contributors who fund the system, and they fund it in the expectation that they will get rewarded for that funding. And I think that's not in the public interest. So I think there will be license branch reform, and I would hope that in the process there would be some attention given to how to fund the political parties in a way that's not detrimental or retrogressive to the public, but will keep our two-party system alive and functioning well, but at the same time not force people to give involuntary political contributions to any party.
Well, taxes are an involuntary contribution that we all get involved in, and one of the questions coming up this time is, should there be an increase in gasoline taxes? What has been proposed is a 4-cent per gallon increase next July 1, as I understand it, and then an increase of 1 cent per year for each of the next 4 years, so that by 1989 we'll be paying 8 cents more per gallon than we're paying now in state gasoline taxes. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's been proposed by an interim study committee.
Do you think that'll go through?
I don't know.
Is it needed?
I believe that we need to look at it. A few years ago, we changed our gas tax formula that would be tied into the escalating cost of gasoline. At that time, everyone was predicting it was going to go to $2 a gallon or higher, and it was going to be on a percentage base, and that was going to take care of our highway funding needs for all time. And what's actually happened is that not only has the rate not gone up as much as people predicted it would, but with smaller compact cars and people being more fuel conscious, the use has gone down, so really the revenue has decreased while the cost of maintaining and building roads has increased. So I would say, yes, there's some justification for some need for some additional funding, but at the same time, I'm not willing to put a big pot of money out there that really doesn't show any actual improvement in our highways and road system, and that the cost just goes up. For instance, if it costs $1 million a mile to pave a mile of road, and we put more money in, and that cost goes up to $1.5 million. We haven't done anything but fill the pockets of the highway contractors. So I think there has to be some assurance that the public will get better roads and repaired bridges for that additional money, and that doesn't go into one's pocket. That's one of the concerns I have. There are a couple of others that don't come to mind right now. I had them on my mind, but I slipped away from me, Jim.
Let me ask you about the bridge repairs. What I read not long ago was that we're literally years behind in repairing our bridges in Indiana. Is this a problem for industry in that they're not able to negotiate to get to where they want to go? And is it something that we can correct overnight by increasing gasoline taxes by 4 cents a gallon?
No, it's not anything we can increase overnight. It is a problem, and it's not only a problem for, I think, a good infrastructure, a highway system is vital for economic development. I guess 75 or 80% of everything that we move in this country is moved by truck or over our roads, so it is important, but I think through a safety factor, right here in Delaware County, we have, I believe, some 800 bridges, and those 800 bridges, probably 60 to 70% of them need some kind of work and repair on them. And we have school buses out in Delaware County that are crossing bridges that no school bus should have to cross. And I think that's something people have to give serious consideration to, because if one of those bridges were to collapse and several youngsters lost their lives, I don't think you can measure that in dollars and cents. So it's a serious problem. It won't be resolved in the next year or two. I don't care what we do, but I think it's something we need to have a long-range plan on and set about doing it in a systematic way so that by the year 2000, say, we would have safe bridges all over Delaware County and the state of Indiana.
And be appreciated by everyone.
Absolutely.
Let me ask you about the lottery. That's come up again and again and again, and I don't know what your position is, but I'd like you to share it. What is that?
Well, the lottery is one of those issues, I think, that comes along, and at some point in time, I think it's proper for the people in the state of Indiana to make the determination as to whether they want our Constitution changed to make that possible. And that's a long process, and I think people should understand that what we're talking about at the present time is a referendum to make a decision as to whether we want that constitutional change made. And the process to do that is that you have to have that pass through one session of the General Assembly, and there must be an election, and then it must pass again. And after that, in the next election, it will go on the ballot for the public to make that determination. And if they say, yes, we want the Constitution changed, then that change will be made. And at the following session of the General Assembly is when legislation would be enacted that would make a determination as to what it would be, whether it would be a lottery, whether bingo would be legalized, whether it would be pari-mutuel horse racing, or what it would be. But right now we're just talking about taking the prohibition out of our state constitution that was put in it back in the 1800s that said no form of gambling would be allowed, because each time it's gone through the General Assembly in the past, the courts have found it to be unconstitutional because of that constitutional prohibition. So we're talking about a 5-year process just to get to the point where we're ready to enact any kind of legislation that would make it happen.
And it's your feeling it should go to the people?
Yes, I feel that the question has become one of such widespread interest that it's time to let the people make the decision.
There's another question up that is going to affect everyone, I guess, and that's the beer baron bill. I don't understand it. Could you explain it, and could you tell us why you think it is good or bad?
Well, that's one I haven't made up my mind. It'll probably be one of the most controversial issues, and I don't know why. I don't get the picture that most people drink beer, but it seems they do when that comes before us. The crux of the issue is that in the beer industry, because it's a controlled substance, that the government regulates who has the license and who can distribute it and how they can distribute it. That has created a situation where in Delaware County, I'd say 5-6 years ago, we had 3 or 4 beer distributors. At the present time, we have none. And what created that problem is that, as I understand it, large wholesalers from outside Delaware County began bringing beer here in truckloads and underselling our local wholesalers, and that forced them out of business. What the beer wholesalers and others are saying now is that If this process is allowed to continue, eventually we will have 3 or 4 beer wholesalers in the whole state of Indiana. And at that point in time, the price will go up and everyone will pay more. The reverse of that is that if we set up exclusive territories to say that certain beer distributors will be allowed to distribute beer in Delaware County and no others, that person will have a monopoly and they in turn will increase the price of beer. It's my opinion that whichever way we go, the cost of beer is going to go up. It doesn't matter whether it's 3 or 4 statewide or 1 or 2 in Delaware County. The cost is going to go up. The question is what kind of system will produce the least cost and afford the most competition under a very restrictive system. And I haven't made up my mind on that yet. I don't know what I'll do.
We have another question on territoriality. This has to do with banks and whether they ought to have the right to open branches across state lines.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think, and what do your constituents tell you?
Well, in the past, I've always voted against that legislation. The reason I voted against it is that under the legislation that has been proposed in the past, theoretically it would be possible for 6 banks to control all the banking in the state of Indiana. My fear in the past has been that all of the money saved by Muncie and Delaware County residents could possibly be deposited in a bank controlled in Indianapolis. And if they had $1 million to loan for a new industry, and Indianapolis was trying to get an industry and Delaware County was trying to get one, they only had $1 million to distribute, that people in Indianapolis would make that decision. And I'm sure they wouldn't make it in the best interest of people in Delaware County. Now, the banks here in Delaware County make those decisions as to where that money will be loaned. But I think we have to face reality, and what's happening now is that large corporations such as Sears, Roebuck, Montgomery Ward, I understand Kmart is getting into the bank business, and a lot of bankers are saying that if they're not allowed to consolidate and get bigger, they will eventually be run out of business by these large conglomerates that are coming into the banking industry. So I do look for some type of compromise. Here in Muncie, in Delaware County, for instance, I think we have 4 different banks, and I think 2 of them were for it and 2 were against it. So anything we did as legislators, we were going to make 50% of the bankers angry. I think some of that has been overcome. It's my understanding that a group called the independent bankers and the larger banks have reached some type of compromise, and hopefully they can get it in some legislation that we can all support.
Well, I'd like to thank you for being our guest on this year in the legislature. We're out of time, but we'll look forward to seeing what happens in this session of the legislature beginning in January.
Thank you.
Again, our guest, Hurley Goodall from the 34th District here in Indiana, and we thank you for joining us. That's it for our program. Good night.